The programme is called Where's the Line? This was on Tuesday evening on BBC Radio 4. It was pitched out as a debate. Of course, that piqued my interest. So I thought, a debate on the BBC? Surely not about Ukraine. So, and sure enough, there were 4 participants, all of whom were Russia haters. I mean, really, you know, all of their views were anti-Russian, blaming the Russians for everything and not taking into account the fact that Ukraine has been run by the West for the last, 8 years at least, and since the coup. And they didn't seem to have recognised the coup. They don't seem to also have recognised the idea that there would be referenda down in the Crimea or in the Donbass regions. None of that was talked about or referenced whatsoever. And, of course, the 15,000 people who live in the Donbass who've been killed over the last 8 years by the Ukrainian army and by the Azov Battalion Nazis down there, which is the reason so that the Russian political forces, with Putin actually reining them back initially, finally decided we're going to go in and stop this because these are ethnic Russians and this is an attack on us as a people by the West using people like Zelensky, etc., as proxy. So let's have a listen to, we got several clips from this the discussion programme that went out called Where's the Line? And by the way, full version of the interview with Scott Ritter up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk later, and of course a full version of this will be available for you to listen to the whole thing if you'd like to too. But I've taken some extracts from it. We're going to start with the BBC's Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen, which is, I mean, obviously the Ukraine is not in the Middle East, but Jeremy Bowen has been sent up to Ukraine to do reports from there anyway. And here he talks about what he says are the Russian atrocities. So he's obviously decided that that these bodies that have been found could not have been killed by the Azov Battalion or by the Ukrainian army, but it must have been the Russians.
Jeremy, you just spent 6 weeks in Ukraine. Were you prepared for what you discovered in those areas that the Russians retreated from?
Yeah, to be honest, I was. I sort of expected it. I've seen the Russian way of warfare before in Grozny, breakaway republic of Russia in the 1990s, in Chechnya, in Syria, extensively. I was in Aleppo when just after the time it was completely flattened, the eastern side, by the Russians and the Syrians. So yes, I was expecting to see some pretty bad things, but I think what is different about this war, what makes it significant, is not so much the level of violence or killing, which is terrible. It's not so much the way that the Russians have driven a tank through international law. It's who's involved. It's the fact that the world's leading powers are looking at each other, staring each other in the face, armed with nuclear weapons, in a way that they haven't, not even since the end of the Cold War, since quite deep into the Cold War. So I've covered many wars in many years at the BBC, but this is, to me, the most significant thing that I've been reporting on in that sense.
Well, clearly, the stakes are much higher in this confrontation than they were in the previous wars that he's suggesting. But, of course, the Russians in Syria have actually pursued a very, very softly approach. That's why it's taken them so long to clear ISIS out of the places that they're captured, because they don't just go in there with guns blazing. He mentions Grozny there. That was in the early stages of the transformation in Russia. And, of course, the Russian army at that stage was very...
Yeltsin era.
That's the Yeltsin era, and of course, backed by the West. And in actual fact, the Russian army at that stage was very, very unprofessional. It had been run down for years. It was all conscripts.
Yeah, in fact, quite a lot of people...
And the only way they knew how to fight was just by blowing everything up.
The other point was quite a lot of the soldiers in the 1990s hadn't been paid for months. They were selling off military equipment on the black market.
That's right. So what's actually happened is that the Russian army has been professionalised. Virtually everybody fighting in the Ukraine are full-time soldiers. They're not conscripts. And they've also, because they've been fighting in Syria, they've learned all sorts of things that you only learn by actually doing.
But what about these atrocities that he talks of?
Well, they've already made up their mind that the Russian army is a bestial organisation that carries out bestial atrocities.
But that's not the job of a journalist like
Bowen
to do that.
In actual fact, the evidence is piling up that the Ukrainians are carrying out massacres of people they don't like, who they think are too pro-Russian. The two British guys that have been taken prisoner, they were saying that they want to be exchanged for Medvedchuk, who's the leader of the opposition in Ukraine, who's actually been taken into custody by Zelensky as a traitor. And Zelensky himself said treason will have consequences. And the SBU are actually going round murdering and torturing the political opposition to Zelensky in Ukraine, none of which is reported in the Western media. The Ukrainians are presented as these freedom-loving Democrats fighting the evil Russians. In actual fact, they're going round. They take the view that Russian-speaking Ukrainians are not real Ukrainians. And that's why, for example, they fired that rocket at the Kramatorsk railway station, because those were Russian-speaking people trying to get out of the way, and of course they don't want them to leave.
So why does the Ukrainian army and NATO seem to want to retake the Donbass region, which is mostly Russian-speaking, if they don't see them as real Ukrainians?
Well, no, what they want is they want the land, but they don't want the people on it. They could kick them all out, ethnically cleanse them out, which is exactly what the Croatian army did in Krajina in the Yugoslav war. When I drove through the Krajina the day after the Croatian army had gone in there, and everybody had left. A few old ladies stayed behind, and they were shot.
You know what
and
this is?
That's what they want. They want the Donbass, but they don't want the Russian speakers who live there.
This is Lebensraum.
It is, yes. I mean, and it's a pretty cruel truth. I mean, this is a civil war between two, rather distinct, they're related people. I mean, the Serbs and Croats are related, the language is related, but there's an awful lot of antagonism between those two groups going back to World War II. It's exactly the same in the Ukraine.
Okay, so our next clip from Where's the Line? This bizarre programme, which was pitched as a debate, which wasn't a debate at all, which is looking at how NATO could get engaged with the Ukraine war. And this is from General Sir Richard Shirreff. He thinks that there should be a massive supply of weapons to the Ukrainian army, and he's a former NATO commander in Europe. Obviously, he's one of the main people on the anti-Russian side of this so-called debate, with nobody whatsoever on the Russian side.
The red line remains, as Douglas said, that attack on a NATO nation. In terms of sustainability, I think that now that we have seen over the last 3 weeks, ever since the heroic defense of Kiev and the battle for Kiev, which, let's put it on the line, was an outstanding achievement by the Ukraine armed forces, there has been a window of opportunity. The Russians retreated. They were defeated. And in every campaign, there's an opportunity to seize the initiative. And the initiative could have been seized better, I think, if there had been if there is a massive supply of weaponry of the sort of things that President Zelensky and the Ukrainians are asking for. So my feeling is that this is the time for NATO to take risk and provide that support. There's a but, though. To do that, NATO has to be ready for the worst case. And the worst case is war with Russia. And that requires a fundamental mindset shift in the nations of NATO. And we're a long way short of that at the moment.
Well, he's saying that NATO have got to get ready for war with Russia now, Martin.
Yes, and he said we're a long way ready from the fact that people in the West public opinion isn't ready for war with Russia. And even if they were ready for war with Russia, how are you going to fight it? The Russians are there with their main armed forces. We have got our armed forces scattered all over the world. Even if the US decided it was going to concentrate all its armed forces in Europe to fight with the Russians, it would take them at least 6 to 9 months to get them into place. And by that stage, the war would be over and the Russians would have won. So it's just silly talk. And of course, he talks about the Kiev being bravely defended and all the rest of it. The Russians retreated because they'd had a meeting with the Ukrainians in Istanbul, and they agreed to withdraw from the forces from around Kiev as part of, negotiations. So they weren't defeated. They could have stayed and fought. They chose not to. And then, of course, the Azov battalion went into Bucha and killed all the people who somehow they thought had cooperated with the Russians during the occupation. And then they claimed that the Russians had done it. That actually may be an Achilles heel of all of this propaganda in the West. If we can expose what happened at Bucha and make ordinary people in this country understand these are your allies, they killed those people, not the Russians, and you say you want to give more weaponry to these people, I say no.
So another one of the participants, along with Jeremy Bowen and this guy, Richard Shirreff, was a US commander, army commander, Douglas Lute. He points out that there are precedents for NATO getting involved outside their own area in the Balkans. And this little contribution from him is followed by Sir Richard Shirreff, who seems to be the... he kind of repeats the same thing again and again. We've got to get ready for fighting the Russians. We've got to get ready for World War III. But let's have a listen to these two now. The two US and British military contributors to this so-called debate, with nobody on the Russian side at all, talking about the Balkans, NATO operating out of its region, and also about preparations for a Third World War.
NATO has only actually suffered one attack in its 70-plus year history to date that actually crossed the threshold as being defined as an armed attack on the territory of one of the member states. And that, of course, was the day after 9/11 in 2001. NATO took the decision to invoke Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause of the NATO Treaty. So there's only been one clear crossing of the, if you will, Article 5 threshold. But NATO's taken it, as you mentioned, in the Balkans, later in Afghanistan as a result of 9/11 and so forth. In Libya, NATO has taken military actions where it has reasoned that a more secure neighborhood outside of the alliance promotes security inside the alliance. So security in the neighborhood was important. And I think certainly beginning in the mid-1990s, the Balkan Wars are good examples of that.
Couldn't exactly that, Richard, apply to Ukraine in the neighborhood?
It absolutely could. And I think, therefore, all bets are on, everything is on the table. But I come back to my point about the imperative of NATO recognizing that it's got to be ready for the worst case. And until NATO is ready for the worst case, it can really make no decisions about any form of intervention, escalation, or the like. And as I say, the worst case means ensuring that our people, our populations, our states are mentally ready and physically ready for the worst case, which is war with Russia.
And you think they still aren't?
No, we haven't begun to think about it. I'm sorry, we just haven't begun to think about it. Life in Britain goes on very much as it has always done. Think what happened after Munich in 1938, which, okay, is seen as the high point of appeasement, but at least there was a mindset changed that allowed the preparations to be put in place so that when war was declared in September 1939, the country was readier for it than it would otherwise have been. Defense spending is way down. We've effectively disarmed in a whole range of areas. To be ready for war means not only preparing our populations for it, it means rearmament, it means seeing defense spending at levels as they were probably during the height of the Cold War, it means regaining and rebuilding lost military capabilities, and it needs political leadership for that to happen.
But a lot of them are quite long-term things, aren't they? They take time.
Well, it's a come-as-you-are party. So we've got to put everything into the shop window that we've got now, which we could. I'm sorry. NATO is an alliance of 2.5 million men and women under arms. Thus far, the alliance has put something like 40,000 onto the eastern flank.
So 2 points there. One made by Douglas Lute from the United States, and one which is about in the neighbourhood. NATO could operate. We're just trying to make Libya more secure, for example. That's why they got involved in Libya, because it was in their neighbourhood. And also then Richard Shirreff comparing Munich 1938 to Kiev 2022.
Well, don't forget, they wheel out Munich at every opportunity, don't they? It's appeasement. In actual fact, what happened at Munich, as Alex Craner pointed out on this show, was that the Czechs were ready to fight the Germans, and the Soviet army said that they would come to Czechoslovakia and fight with them. And at that point, the British pulled the plug. And of course, they could have been stopped there. But of course, to make the comparison that every war that's ever been fought is always, we mustn't avoid appeasement. I feel like saying to the Americans, hang on a minute, you weren't involved in World War II until after Pearl Harbor. So what are you talking about? You weren't involved with appeasement. You just didn't have any relationship with what was going on whatsoever until you were dragged in. So the historical analogies are pathetic. And of course, the other point I'd make to the General is this. If you are going to build up British armed forces to take on the Russians, pretty absurd idea if you think about it, then it's going to take you at least 10 to 15 years to do all of that. And by that stage, the Russians will have won the existing war. What are you talking about?
Jeremy Bowen also contributed this whole concept of to what extent the superpowers are already involved, and NATO is already involved in Ukraine.
The Kremlin said that continuing to arm Ukraine risked unpredictable consequences.
Yes, and by unpredictable consequences, a lot of people thought that they were directly referring to some kind of nuclear use of nuclear weapons. You know, if you go back in time, you go by the rules of the original Cold War. In that war, it was sort of within the game for the superpowers to supply countries that were directly fighting their opponents. For example, the Americans gave a lot of weapons to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan when they were fighting the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, after the mid-60s, was the main supplier of weapons to the North Vietnamese army fighting the Americans, and that didn't set off a Third World War. It was considered to be something that was allowed under the rules that they had at the time. Now, I don't know if President Putin wants to change those rules or certainly threaten, but I certainly feel that it would be seen as a provocation and it would be a risk, but maybe that's a risk that is within the boundaries of something that could be taken.
Well, the obvious answer to that is that if you want to supply weapons to the Ukraine, and obviously they are supplying weapons to the Ukraine to kill Russian soldiers, the Russians could decide to say, we're going to kick the Yanks out of Syria and we're going to retake the Golan Heights from the Israelis. Because if we're going to have a global war, it ain't just going to be about the Ukraine, is it? You've got plenty of interests and facilities all over the world, and if we're going to have you're allowed to supply our enemies in Ukraine with weaponry, well, maybe we should be supplying your enemies with weaponry in Yemen, for example, to kill the Saudis and the British and American troops who are embedded with them. And of course, ultimately, the Iranians and the Russians may decide that they're going to clean up in the Middle East, because in actual fact, if there is rules where you can supply weapons to people, then we can supply weapons to people, and the whole thing will escalate, and there will be a world war.
But it's not just
the West
about,
will lose.
Martin, I mean, it's quite fair for Jeremy to talk there about the Chinese supplying weapons to North Korea, the US supplying them to South Korea, etc., isn't it? Because there's a precedent set after World War II for this. This has been happening continually.
Okay, so the fact is that if you're going to say it's okay for us to supply weaponry to the Ukraine, incidentally, of course, from a military point of view, as Scott Ritter would point out, it's a waste of time. They won't get any. Don't forget, the main Ukrainian army is now surrounded. They can't get anything into them. So supplying more weapons to Kiev won't make the slightest bit of difference to the military balance on the ground. It's just a lot of posturing. And of course, the danger with this posturing is that if the Moskva was sunk by NATO shenanigans, then of course the obvious answer for the Russians to do is pick their moment and sink a US or British ship with all hands on board.
A flagship.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the one to go
say,
for,
okay, there's your...
Say an aircraft
carrier, yeah. And don't forget, the Russians have got these hypersonic missiles now where they can hit anything anywhere on the planet within half an hour. So they could easily decide, right, well, this is the base that's sending the Americans are sending stuff into Britain to go onto the Ukraine, but we're going to sink the ships as they cross the channel, for example. And you can see how quickly this could escalate. And of course, it'll escalate so quickly that the general will not have time to prepare the population for the war or to increase defence spending. And of course, would have to print the money unless we're going to raise taxes on the wealthy. And of course, during the Korean War in the 1950s, the top rate of tax in both the United States and Britain was 95% plus. And that's what the wealthy will have to pay if they want to have a war.
Russia's tested a new ballistic missile this week called the Sarmat, and China has one called the YJ-21. This is, these are new ballistic missiles, apparently the very best in the world, massive range. I know the Sarmat, I was looking at it yesterday, 15 multiple, independent re-entry vehicles, MIRVs, each of which can carry a megaton warhead in one of these. It's in a public display of force. Russia's newest heavy long-range intercontinental ballistic missile blasted off on Wednesday from a test silo in Plesetsk in western Russia. The media said it flew nearly 6,000 kilometres, that's nearly 4,000 miles, before hitting targets in Kamchatka on the other side of the vast country. The intercontinental ballistic missile, Sarmat, or ICBM, has been in development for many years and designed to replace the older Soviet legacy S-18 missiles. They are meant to fly around the planet, showering strategic targets with multiple nuclear weapons in a nuclear war that no one wants to fight.
Well, if people say no one wants to fight it, but the danger is that by this basically loose talk, NATO keeps saying we want to fight the Russians, but we don't want to admit we're doing it. Or yes, we do want to admit we're doing it, and ultimately the Russians are going to take them up on it.
Do you know what?
If you say you want to fight us, maybe we'll fight you.
Do you know what the range?
If you want it, you can have it.
Do you know what the range of this is?
It can go, but I imagine it can probably go at least 20,000 miles.
Well, actually 22,000
miles.
Which
is enough to hit anywhere on the planet.
It can go, well, not only can it go hit anywhere on the planet, it can also go the long way round.
Yeah. That's right.
So what's the significance of them testing this and letting us know about it right now?
Well, the Russians have been upgrading their missile forces, as have the Iranians, for many years, because ultimately missiles are going to make navies and air forces obsolete. In fact, they've already done it. They are. It will take at least another generation for the Western powers to develop similar stuff, and they haven't got the time. Well, it's too late.
The Where's the Line programme on the BBC didn't really even address the question of where's the line at all. Nevertheless, even though they had the 4 people on there from the anti-Russian, pro-NATO people on there, including a woman from Chatham House who was nearly in tears, Ukrainian woman. Chatham House, of course, being the Royal Institute for International Affairs, along with the Council on Foreign Relations, being set up initially funded by the Cecil Rhodes and the Round Tables in order to take over the world. That was Cecil Rhodes's idea. But anyway, the point here being that there are other systems, aren't there? For example, there's satellite systems, cyber warfare systems, electronic warfare systems, economic warfare, Martin, that the Russians might take issue with, that the NATO countries are using against them.
Well, I mean, everything is going to be used. Hopefully, not nuclear weapons. But we are now in you could say that the war's already started. If you're living in the Ukraine or in Syria, I mean, there's been a war, the World War III has been going on in Syria for a decade and more now. Yeah, and if you live there, you know.
It seems to me they're throwing absolutely everything they can at this, other than actual troops on the ground. But then, of course, special forces.
Yes, I mean, what they're doing is they're creating this whole mythology of the Ukrainian guerrilla forces that will somehow resist the Soviet tanks and so on. It's just not feasible if you think about it. The Ukraine is very, very flat. It's a very flat place. There's nowhere to hide. There are no mountains. There are just urban areas. And you can't really sustain a guerrilla war in those circumstances. It's not Afghanistan. So it's basically, as you can see, a fairly conventional battle of a World War II kind, with tanks, artillery, and companies of infantry.
Well, it's not World War II, is it? Because this very rarely happened in World War II, where the army decided to deliberately embed itself in amongst loads of civilians and housing estates.
Well, they did. I mean, if you think of the Eastern Front, the Germans didn't give much of a stuff about civilian casualties. And nor did the Russians either. I mean, basically, if you were in the way, you just got mashed up. I think what the Russians are doing now in Ukraine, which is exactly what they've done in Syria, is that they bottle people up inside wherever they can bottle them up, and then they whittle them down. And
for example,
offering them the chance to surrender.
The German army could have embedded itself in Paris and caused an awful lot of trouble for the Allies, couldn't it? But they decided, no, we don't want to do that. Let's go.
No, they didn't. I mean, they got driven out in 10, but there was actually...
They weren't driven out, they retreated from Paris.
Well, don't forget there was an uprising in Paris itself, led by the Gaullists and the Communists, and what they did. I mean, that's because they wanted to show that they weren't just going to be liberated by the British.
Final clip from Where's the Line, which never addressed Where's the Line at all, is from Jeremy Bowen. Bless him. What if Ukraine starts to lose the war? Well, a lot of people would argue that they've already lost it. But anyway, let's have a listen to see what he had to contribute, if anything.
I think there's a really big decision potentially that might be necessary if the Ukrainians start losing. Now, if you think back, it's less than 2 months, but February, when all this happened, the expectation then among non-Ukrainians especially was that the whole thing would be over in about a week. And there was no move from Western countries, NATO, to actually intervene and help. No one expected to. But the real sea change has come because the Ukrainians militarily have done so well. President Zelensky has gone from being a slightly joke figure, an ex-comedian, to a really respected war leader. And we've heard President Biden in the US and Boris Johnson here has even been to Ukraine, absolutely trumpeting their support for him. So here's the scenario. What happens if in, I don't know, 3, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, the President Zelensky in one of his appeals online says, we are losing. We need air support or more from NATO, or our armed forces are going to be cut to pieces. What then does NATO do when it's faced with almost with an ultimatum from its own ally?
Well, what they will do is they can't do anything. I mean, what can they do? It's absurd, this kind of conversation. If they try to put in a no-fly zone, which is what he's hinting at there, the Russians will simply shoot down your planes. Not only that, they will attack the bases from which those planes flew. That could be, for example, Fairford down the road from here. It would take a Kinzhal missile less than 20 minutes to hit it. And then you've got to make a decision. Are we going to fire our missiles back into Russia? And of course, the Russians will have some capacity to prevent that. And, you've gone from, if the Ukraine is losing the war, and there's nothing NATO can do about it. If they wanted to intervene in the war, just think how long it took to prepare to attack Iraq. It took nearly a year to get all the forces in place to do it. So where, are NATO capable of doing that? They haven't got the forces to do it, as Scott Ritter will point out.
Well, you're saying 2.5 million men or something in arms. Yeah, but NATO, of course they have.
Well, yeah, but they're all over the place, aren't they?
Well, they can concentrate them.
Well, if you concentrated them, the Russians will simply hit them with their missiles, won't they? Because they'll see the punch coming a mile off. So what are they talking about? There's no realism about either the political or military situation there. It's just a lot of narcissistic, self-referential stuff. And of course, that doesn't win wars.
Well, demonstrations have been taking place in support of Ukraine, particularly in London. One was on Saturday, the 9th of April, and this was organised by PCS and other trade unions in central London. And the journalist Michael Tracy was down there. He recorded this rather curious chant from the trade unions.
On Ukraine! On Ukraine! On Ukraine!
So, arm Ukraine, put an end to Putin's reign.
Yeah, I read a report about this demonstration. It was and Paul Mason spoke at it, and there is an element on the left in Britain that sees the Ukraine as something like the Spanish Civil War, and that the Ukrainians are fighting fascism, Russian fascism.
So the British should basically ship themselves over there and join the Ukrainian army.
Well, the idea, the thing that gets me about all of this is it's just projection of fantasy stuff. What military difference do you think it would make if either NATO intervened or people just decided they were going to go and fight for the Ukraine? They can't get into the Ukraine without being killed. The Ukrainian army is now surrounded. How are you going to rescue them? By sending more weapons to the Ukraine. It's not going. What's going to happen is that there will be probably quite a rapid end to this now, as Scott Ritter was suggesting. The Ukraine is going to be partitioned, and the rump West Ukraine, which will not have access to the sea, I pretty much guarantee that, because don't forget Transnistria broke away from Moldova in the 1990s, and that's basically a Russian-speaking sliver of land which could be linked up to to Crimea. And if you look at the map of Ukraine before the war, all of the Russian-speaking areas are all in that eastern and southern quadrants, and they will become independent of Kiev. And what will happen in Kiev is quite possibly a civil war between people who are blaming Zelensky for surrendering and all the rest of it. And the Russians will just watch. And there's no way, no military way at all that NATO can intervene in this war and win. They can't. The Ukrainians can't win. NATO can't win. It's only a matter of time. There's going to be a partition of the Ukraine, just as there was a partition of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. Kosovo is not going to be part of Serbia.